Hello, it's Christy with Green Living Off-Grid, and today we're going to be looking at how you can prepare your garden beds in the fall to have beautiful gardens in the spring. The first thing I want to talk about is the soil that you want to start with when you're going to build a garden bed that will be able to produce well for you. The first thing I had to do, because I live in Colorado and we have clay and granite and a lot of sand in our soil, I had to dig out the area that I wanted to have a garden bed in, and I built some beds into the ground. My wooden beds, as you can see here, are built into the ground. And what this allowed me to do is to be able to grow my strawberries and my raspberry plants all year round, and it helped maintain that soil temperature in the winter when it gets really cold. So if you have a situation where you're going to be growing plants all year round and you want to maintain the roots, you might want to think about an in-ground garden bed system. But most gardens, if you're just going to do something over the spring and summer and you don't have to worry about frost, winter kill, good raised beds are fine for a garden. But that's the first thing I did, is I built a raised bed. As you can see here, I have 8-foot beds that are about 8 foot by 3 feet. And I replaced the soil in the beds with a good garden soil, so that I had something good to start with that was not all full of the gravelly, sandy, clay stuff that we have here. It's very difficult to grow in. And then I put in some sphagnum peat moss, mixed it in, about one big bale that I got over at Home Depot, a big bale of sphagnum peat moss to help aerate the soil and get it a little bit more loose. So I ended up with a really nice garden soil. And then I worked in manure. And I do this manure, I add manure to my gardens every year. I just did the sphagnum peat moss that first year when I started my beds. And then after that, all I do is I work about 2-3 inches of manure into the soil and mix it after I have pulled out all of the weeds from that year's growing. And then the last thing that I do is, after I add all this manure, I heap it over, as you can see in this bed. This thing's about, I have about 4 to 6 inches of manure over this bed. I just fill it up with manure, and what that does is that enables the manure to work in. If I do this in the fall, it works into the soil all winter long as the snow falls, and then in the spring I'll end up with about 1 inch or 2, probably more like 2 inches of a nice thick coating of manure over top of my soil. And that provides a natural weed barrier. Now, weeds will still grow in manure, but if you have a big amount of manure on top of your beds that work down over the winter, even if it's fresh manure, it will provide a nice barrier in the spring to cut down on your weeds. And so I do this every year. I'll take my bed and clean out the weeds, work the manure into the soil, so that it has a nice bit of amenities in the soil, and then cover it with my good solid 4 to 6 inches of manure that will work into the soil over the winter. And there you have it. That is how I prepare my garden beds in the fall in order to have nice gardens in the spring. And I'm able to grow my raspberry bushes, and I do water them in the winter, because you will have winter kill if you don't water them. I water them from my aquaponics system when I change my fish water every week. So I do keep these guys pretty well hydrated all winter long, and I'll put manure around them in the fall as well. And then, of course, I do have to trim them. As you can see, we did have a nice snow. I'll trim them in the fall in order for them to better produce berries in the spring. So there's my setup. I have these garden beds. I have these white PVC. The white PVC I use as a structure for a watering grid system that I set up in the spring. I'll show you guys that when I plant my gardens in the spring, how that system works. But the I basically have these garden beds that are down into the ground, and then I have manure that I've mixed in after, of course, the first year where I had mixed in sphagnum peat moss. But then a manure every year in the fall. And then in the spring, I'm able to plant, and it definitely makes a difference in the yield and the produce I'm able to have with the garden, with a whole lot less weeds than you would typically get in the clay soil that we have here in Colorado. And as you can see here, having garden beds that are built into the ground really provides a nice support for strawberries. And one thing that I have encountered with strawberries is we have ground critters that like to eat roots of plants. So in these particular garden beds, I also put a wire mesh netting underneath, about a foot down, underneath the boards that I had built into the soil, and that has really cut down on the ability of those gophers and different ground critters to get in here and eat the roots of my plants. So my strawberries, this is about my probably 5th year with these strawberries. They are starting to get some weeds into them, and so I'm probably gonna have to dig them up in the spring and try to get some more planted in here. But yeah, my strawberries do really well in these in-ground beds, garden beds, and we get some pretty cold weather here in Colorado. It gets down to -10 sometimes in the winter, but with a nice snow layer over on top, and of course watering them on the warm, dry days in the winter, it does seem to keep them from year to year in this garden bed. They grow pretty well. Thanks again for watching. Feel free to check us out at greenlivingoffgrid.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.